The new Mirrorwatch LTM in Overwatch 2 has hugely changed the abilities of all these characters, altering some of their playstyles entirely. That's why in this video I'll be making a tier list ranking every hero's changes from S to F, based on how creative and fun I think they are. Each hero's power will also play somewhat of a role, as it can impact their enjoyability, but this is not a meta tier list, so just keep that in mind. Now let's get into it. Alright, let's start off with Doomfist's Overwatch variation, and this is going straight into the A tier. Now, I actually really like this one, so let's just quickly go through his updated abilities. So, his Slam gives overhealth to you and nearby allies when leaping. Now, this is pretty cool, and it does kind of change his role slightly into being more defensive for the team, as it gives overhealth to his allies, but that's just the start of this. So, let's look into the power block, which is where the biggest changes are, really. So basically, he gets a huge Rhine shield on his block, which can protect the whole team, but then he still gets that effect where if the enemy shoots it, it charges up his rocket punch, which now actually increases his movement speed and his allies' movement speed when using empowered punch after charging up with that barrier. So this is actually a really powerful ability, but also a pretty cool take. You know, like, they've gone from this tiny block which only protects himself to having this huge shield which covers his entire team basically, while still keeping some of those core things in his kit. And then with his ult, you have the same effects as usual, but it also grants a huge amount of overhealth to you and your allies. So what they've done here is basically change his entire role to be more defensive and team reliant, which is actually really good for the theme of him becoming an Overwatch hero instead of being Talon. And I actually really like these overall. It's an innovative change to his playstyle, whilst also being nothing too groundbreaking, which completely changes him. And so I think that A tier is pretty fair. It's not like insane, but I'd still say that it is one of the better changes, and it's quite enjoyable to play, especially because of that shield. Up next is Rhine, and he's going to be going into the B tier for me. Now, Rhine has gotten some interesting changes. So his shield just got a straight up buff in that allies who shoot projectiles through it actually get a damage increase on all those projectiles. And also the small thing that when your shield breaks, you get movement speed increase. Now that last thing isn't that significant, although it can help you get to cover when your shield breaks. But the thing where it allows your allies' projectiles to get damage boost is actually really cool, and I do like it, and it allows him to be a little more offensive in terms of that Talon role, whilst still being Reinhardt, you know, with that huge shield. It doesn't give him the capability necessarily, but it gives his team the capability to do more damage, really, which is quite cool. And I do like it overall. Then we also have his passive, which when you hit someone with your hammer, it increases your attack speed, and I do think this stacks. I'm not entirely sure, but I do think it stacks. So this then also gives him the ability to be more offensive by himself. So it goes both ways in that sense, where he allows both himself and his teammates to be more offensive. So it's basically just straight up buffs here. There's pretty much nothing that nerfs him, and I do like the changes overall, but they're not too special. He then also gets his change to his Earth Shatter, where instead of being this wide cone that you shoot and then like stun enemies, it's instead a very narrow beam, but then it does a huge amount of damage basically. So it's not exactly easy to hit. I mean, I'm a Rhine main. They think I can aim, but you know how it is. And it is quite difficult to hit when you're used to the normal Earth Shatter, used to that huge arc, but I do still think that it's a cool and creative change, kind of doing the opposite of what it was before. And now if you do hit people with it, it can do a huge amount of damage and get you some crazy kills, to be honest. So yeah, that's about all there is to Rhine's changes. I think they're cool, but for the most part they're nothing special, and so I think B tier is pretty fair. Next up we have Zarya, and I don't really love her changes quite as much, so she'll be going into C. Now with Zarya, the first thing they changed is her secondary fire, which instead of shooting these projectiles which have very high gravity of them, I guess you could say, which then like these orbs that explode and they go in an arc, they've instead changed it to being projectiles which like go straight and pass through the enemies, and do like some taking damage to them. It's kind of cool, but it uses a lot of ammo and it doesn't feel very good to use. I'm not actually sure if it's good or not, to be honest, but either way, it doesn't feel great. That's just for me personally. Maybe I just haven't played her enough yet to experience the benefits of it, but even though it's a cool change, it just doesn't feel very good. And then they updated both of her bubbles, which makes it so that when they expire, whether you break them or they just run out naturally, they do some damage to the enemies and knock them back. This is a cool change, and it does also fit into that more villainous set, I guess, but it doesn't feel like a lot, you know? Like, it doesn't feel like very significant changes, and as Zarya yourself, I mean, you notice it, but it's not that big, you know? And then the last change they have is on her ult, which basically, instead of pulling people into the grab, it pushes people away. Which, in concept, is actually a pretty good idea. It's quite creative at basically just reversing the ability's effects. But in practice, it's kind of difficult to use well. Where grab, you can kind of group up with the enemies and make them really easy to hit. This ult instead is kind of about blocking people off and like splitting up the enemy team, or like, you know, pushing them away from stuff, but it's not quite as useful. And I mean, I've probably just not played it enough yet, as I have more so spread out my playtime across all the characters to try and get some experience on all of them. So I've not played anyone individually that much, but it just feels like it's not going to be generally as useful and not very enjoyable to use for the most part. I mean, it surely has its moments, I would assume, if you can like get it to work properly, but for the most part, it's not ideal. And I think it combines with the other changes to, like, it's not bad, but it's just not my favorite set of changes, to be honest. On to Bastion now, and I actually really like these changes, and so he's going to be our first S tier hero. Now, basically what they've done is they've actually changed a whole lot of Bastion. So the first thing is they've changed his primary fire from being this precise long range thing that maybe doesn't do a huge amount of damage but can consistently hit some shots at range. It's now set as shotgun, which does quite a lot of damage, but of course it does not have that same precision at range, which I do like the changes, and it honestly feels pretty good. It obviously has its advantages and disadvantages versus the old primary fire, but overall I do like it. And then the turret mode, which is what I would argue to be the biggest change, is instead replaced with an entirely new ability called Configuration Intel. Now, basically what this does is it gives you infrasight during its duration and increases your attack and reload speed. So I actually think it's pretty cool, and although it kind of does take away some of Bastion's personality, I guess, in terms of like him losing this turret mode, I do think it's honestly kind of better overall, and it's better for the game, the health of the game and stuff. It makes Bastion a less annoying character to play without making him... it makes Bastion a less annoying character to play against without making him less fun to play. And I know this isn't really the point of this patch, but honestly, it's probably a better ability for Bastion in terms of just the game as a whole. So that's something I would say about all of these Bastion changes in general. Maybe not that balanced on the whole, but I honestly do really like them, and not only do they feel like they could work in the normal game, but they're also really enjoyable to play in this and give a nice creative mix up to his kit. So moving on to his grenade, they've not changed much here, but they've basically made it so that you're immune to damage from it, which means that you can just grenade jump to Narnia as much as you want and basically just fly around like whenever your grenade is off cooldown, you know. So that's actually really nice. It's not a big change, but I think the impact of it is actually quite noticeable despite it not seeming that big at first. And then finally we have his ultimate, which has been replaced from just shooting down like artillery missiles to sending in 4 allied slices. Now this is actually quite cool and a very interesting change. Now it doesn't actually feel that good to use, and it's kind of annoying to play against. So if they were to move this Bastion into the normal game, which I doubt they would do, but if they did, then I would probably change this ult. But on the other hand, it is quite creative and I do like it. On the whole, like, it is a nice mix-up from Bastion's old ult, but maybe just not like great overall. But I still think that on the whole, Bastion's changes are just really enjoyable, and so I think he's probably has the best changes of any hero in this mode, in my opinion. You know, that's just my opinion, but yeah, that's pretty much it. Moving on to Echo, and I actually also really like Echo's changes, so she's going straight into the A tier for me. So the first thing they've changed is her sticky bombs, which instead of being these fast moving accurate projectiles, they changed to these kind of slow moving semi-homing missile sticky bombs, sorry, that they don't really feel better or worse to use or play against. They're just kind of different, which is honestly not a bad thing. I like what they've done with it in terms of not maybe it being the best changes, but just that it's a change from, like, it's a significant change from what it is normally, and I just think that in itself is quite interesting. But overall, it's an alright change. But the biggest change to Echo is actually to her flight. So instead of being this really slow moving flight that you have a lot of control over but don't really have the speed on, instead into this super fast flight which can just send you so far. It's kind of hard to control, to be honest, at least until you get used to it. Like, when I started playing Echo, I was like, what the hell is going on, you know? But then, once you do get used to it, it's so much fun. Like, you go so fast, if you're comparing it to normal Echo, at the very least. And it's honestly really enjoyable to play with, in my opinion. But then we also have a focusing beam, which is the same as normal, except it also slows the enemy, which just seems broken as hell. Like, I don't know why they did this specifically. I mean, I guess it's fun to use, but that's just kind of because it's really good. So, like, I don't really know what more to say about that. And then finally we have the ult, which is kind of the most disappointing part of this change, in my opinion. Because Echo's ult is kind of like her entire character personality, and so they instead change it to something really boring, which I guess kind of makes sense. They changed it from her, you know, copying other characters to gain power to her instead just gaining power herself by increasing her attack speed and reducing her cooldowns, but I just don't like it personally. It doesn't feel very enjoyable or satisfying to use, and when you compare it to Echo's normal ult, which I think is really cool, it just feels like a huge downgrade. And although the whole point of this mode is kind of just to make changes, I appreciate that they made a change. I'm not a huge fan of it, and so that's why she's getting kept in the A tier instead of the S tier for me. Following on from that, we have Sombra, and she's also going to be going into the A tier in my opinion. Now, these changes are actually very interesting because the biggest part of this is that she can now actually hack allies. I don't think she can hack enemies anymore, but honestly, it's a very cool change. So basically, when you hack allies, they gain increased attack speed and overhealth. So this kind of changes her from being this backline assassin to now being a more supportive DPS. She can still do some decent damage, but I like the way that it changes her role entirely and changes her playstyle entirely. They also significantly increased the range of this hack just to kind of enable her to better support her teammates, I guess. And this is emphasized by the rest of the changes as well. So the virus does do its normal thing, but then on top of that, it also decreases the damage of the enemy that you hit it with. So basically, you can kind of use it more supportively as well. If your team is taking heavy damage from a specific target, you can use it on them to kind of just negate part of their damage and make them way less effective, thereby kind of keeping your teammates alive. So it's kind of like Sombra's been turned into a hybrid DPS support, which is honestly a really cool change from the normal Sombra, and it honestly feels pretty good to play as well. I'm not saying that like they should do this as a change, but considering that she's changed to an Overwatch hero and that she's now like kind of using her hacking for good, I think it's really cool. And then we get onto her ult, which is actually called Antivirus, which is basically like a mini Lucio sound barrier, which gives you your entire team in a radius over health, but then it also increases your attack speed and the attack speed of allies. So it just emphasizes this more supportive playstyle, and although like these changes aren't like insane, I actually really like them, and I like how they have the creativeness of just entirely changing her playstyle with this this villain to hero swap rather, and overall I do like it, and that's why it's in the A tier. However, it's time to stop with the top tier reworks, because here comes Tracer, who's actually going to be our one and only F tier. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that Tracer's changes are just awful, because they're not, and they're actually decently fun to play, but it just feels like they've not really changed a lot with her. So all they've done is that the blink is the same, but you can basically deal damage to yourself to do it more, yeah, that's fine. I mean, it's a cool buff, I guess, but it's not a huge change, and I don't really see like where it's coming from, but like sure. And then she's got a new passive where after dealing enough continuous damage, she gets more attack speed and gains some lifesteal, which is also kind of cool, but it just overall, like, that's all there is, you know. There's not a lot to it, and although Tracer at her base also doesn't have a lot to it, I feel like there was still so much more they could have done with this that they just didn't do, and I guess part of that disappointment is kind of why she's in the F tier for me. That doesn't mean that she's boring to play, because she's not, you know. She's still fun to play, but it feels way too similar just to regular Tracer in my opinion, whereas a lot of these other characters feel like they've changed significantly and their roles or playstyles have changed significantly, and that's why I enjoy a lot of these higher tier reworks that I've placed higher on the list. But Tracer, on the other hand, is just kind of the exact opposite. She's still good, but they've just not done a lot, and so there's just not much more to say about it either, so that's why she's an F, to be honest. Widowmaker, on the other hand, has some pretty solid changes, and so she's going into the B tier for me. So the first thing that they've done with her is that her sniper, now with fully charged shots, highlights her enemies. So I'm gonna get onto this later, but they've also changed her ult so that she no longer gains infrasight on that, but they've kind of moved over her infrasight to her basic weapon, which I do think is kind of cool. It doesn't do a lot for like her playstyle, I guess, but it is a cool change that kind of maneuvers around her abilities in a way. So her next change is that instead of a Venom Mine, she now has a shield that she can place in front of her, and this is a pretty cool shield. I like the form of it, where if you're standing behind it, you can just about shoot over it, but if you crouch, the enemy can't hit you, which I think is a really cool barrier for a sniper like Widow to have. And then the final change, as I was saying earlier, is that her infrasight is no longer an infrasight in terms of that it gives you like vision on the enemy, but instead it highlights weak points on the enemy. So basically it just makes their headshot hitbox bigger, I guess, or like their critical damage hitbox way bigger, and it kind of moves it as well. So I think this is something that both you and your teammates can use, but I mean it's a decent change, and I mean it makes sense for a sniper hero. But overall, it just feels like Widow's kind of the same. Like, they've changed a lot about her kit, but Widow's still Widow, you know? If you hit shots, then you'll win, and if you miss shots, then you'll lose. And obviously, that's kind of a stupid thing to say, because you could say that about a lot of characters and every DPS, pretty much. However, I think with Widow, like, the changes are good, so she's in B tier, but I can't really place her any higher, because she still kind of feels the same, you know? Now it's time for the support, and starting us off is of course Anna. So the first thing we've done here is that her gun, her biotic rifle, now damages enemies instantly instead of that over time damage from before, and it can also headshot. So I don't know the exact numbers on this. I don't know how much damage it does exactly compared to like the tick damage over time before, but it is pretty cool change, and I like how it kind of contrasts to what she previously was in a way. It feels kind of weird when you first use it, because you're not used to the way it works, I guess, but overall it is pretty cool, and it allows you to take some more like sniper duels, you know. Like I killed this Widow just randomly in a sniper duel, because, you know, now I can just headshot her, peek back around cover, I guess, which you could kind of do before as well, but you know what I mean. But yeah, so then after that, they've also updated her biotic grenade, and I don't really know what they've changed. I mean, they changed the anti-effect to just reducing healing instead of completely negating that, but I don't think they changed it in any other way, so I don't really know what they're doing there, because that just seems like a straight up nerf to me, which feels like a really weird change for them to have here. It doesn't really like change the way it works, it just straight up nerfs it. I mean, I could be missing something here, but that's what it seems like to me, which kind of like, why? I don't really understand that change personally, but the next change is that her nano, of course you can nano yourself now, And now, it feels like we've seen this before in things like the April Fool's patch. I could be wrong on that, but I mean, it's a pretty cool change. But one difference here, however, is that when you nano yourself, instead of doing extra damage, you apply this reduced healing effect to the enemies. So, I mean, this is kind of cool because you kind of gain like a semi-anti effect on your gun when you nano yourself, but you don't actually do more damage, so you can't really just start going crazy with a sniper and just headshotting everyone with that nano on you. But I mean, the concept of nanoing yourself is still like a good change, but it feels like it's been used multiple times already. So like, you know, it's decent, but it's nothing special. And then she also gains, as a passive, she gains Hands of Launch. Now, I don't really know why they did this, but it's kind of cool. Basically just gives her more mobility, more survivability, and just ability to kind of like keep herself alive more and stay away from bad situations. It's kind of quite helpful actually, and I do like the change. But overall, you know, her changes aren't good, aren't bad, so she's going into the B tier, to be honest. Moving on to Brig, who actually has a decent amount of changes, but for me, she still goes into the C tier, so allow me to explain why. So the first change they've done is that her repair pack now grants your allies lifesteal as well as healing them. I think it heals them less, but it grants them lifesteal. So this is quite cool, but it doesn't feel very good when you're using it as Brig because you don't actually notice that your allies getting lifesteal, you know? It just feels like you're healing them less. Of course, that doesn't mean that it's actually like that, but as the Brig player, when you're actually playing Brig, it doesn't necessarily feel good, which is kind of a big thing, to be honest, for me, like in terms of these changes just trying to be fun, but it kind of makes her healing feel worse, if anything. But then after that, they've updated her whip shot, which instead of knocking the enemy back when you hit them with it, it pulls them towards you. Now, I do like this change. It's relatively creative, you know, and it's a decent change overall. It can be quite helpful. It doesn't pull the enemy towards you fully, just like a tiny bit. It feels like they could have had you pull them towards you a bit more. Obviously, that would be like crazy OP, but I mean, who cares, you know? It's just a fun mode at the end of the day. It's just a fun LTM. So that would have been cool to see, although I did get hooked off the map this one time, so, you know, there is that. But overall, it's a pretty decent change, but it's nothing special, you know? After that, they've also changed her shield, where if you take damage with it, it empowers it, and if you bash people with it, then it puts them on fire. Which, I mean, you know, it's cool, but it doesn't feel like anything special. So even though, like, as you can see here on the site, it says that they've updated 4 of her abilities, it doesn't really feel like it. It feels like they've updated 2 abilities and like nerfed the repair pack. That's not me saying that that's what it is, but that's just me saying that that's how it feels. And so even though they aren't necessarily bad, they just are worse than quite a few of the other hero changes on this list, and so that's why she's in the C tier for me. Now, penultimately, we have the face of this Mirrorwatch mode, which is Mercy, who's going into the A tier in my opinion. Now, Mercy's changes are pretty cool, to be honest. So, the first thing she does is that when you're damage boosting someone with your staff, it also does some damage over time to the enemies that ally is near, which it's not anything special, I guess, but it is pretty cool. And when you're playing Mercy, you know, it feels pretty good to be damage boosting someone, but then also get that damage tick of dealing damage. I guess like just kind of stimulates your dopamine and endorphins a bit, which you know, it doesn't actually do that much, but it's still a pretty fun change, to be honest, in a way. But then the biggest change is that they've removed her revive, but then they've added something called soul burn, which you can basically from range detonate the dead soul of a fallen enemy or ally, and it basically explodes and deals a pretty hefty chunk of damage. I think it's like 200 and something damage, which is quite a lot. It might be 200 exactly, I'm not sure, but it's enough to like one-shot a tracer, I think, which is pretty cool, to be honest. And I like how it changes her from being this supportive character from Overwatch, where she can bring her allies back to life, to now being this more, I guess, Talon kind of character, where sure, she still has her staff which can heal you, but she's now a lot more aggressive and can now, instead of bring her allies back to life, now bring the enemies to death, which sounds kind of stupid when I say it like that, but you know what I mean. So I do like that change. It's quite cool. But then they've also changed her ultimate. So when you ult, you still have this thing where you can fly around and stuff. But then it also says your abilities are enhanced, which I assume just means that your soul burn does more damage. I don't really know, but I assume that's what it means. But then the big thing is that you basically just gain this like missile shooter on your staff, I guess. So you can basically just fly around in the sky as like just a plane just flying around and then just like missile bombard the enemy, just shooting them like crazy with this. And I mean, you know, it's pretty cool. It feels like it's a little bit long first off, and it feels like damage could be a little higher, so I think it would probably be better. Or maybe the damage couldn't be higher. Maybe I'm just bad. Actually, I'm just bad. Yeah, that's definitely it. But it feels like they last for a little bit long. It feels like when you're on the enemy team, it feels like you're just getting bombarded by missiles the entire time. It feels like it lasts way too long. But other than that, it is a pretty cool change, to be honest. And it again changes her role, I guess, on the team to be more aggressive, which I do like. And so on the whole, I definitely think that her changes deserve to go into the A tier. Finally, ending off the video, we have Zenyatta, and his changes definitely B tier in my opinion. Now, for the most part, these changes don't actually do all that much, although they are pretty cool. So his healing orb, his orb of harmony, when you put it on an ally and you headshot an enemy, it increases the healing, or like spreads, like the healing increases to allies around them. I don't remember exactly how it works, but it basically increases your healing when you deal damage to the enemy, which is pretty cool. And then your Orb of Discord, as well as increasing the damage that an enemy takes, it also poisons them, which does a little bit of damage over time. But then if you headshot that person, it then spreads it to other enemies nearby, which is also a pretty cool change. You know, it's nothing special, it's just like changing how the orbs work. But then again, there's only so much that you can even do in the first place with Zen. So like, you know, they could have changed his primary fire, but maybe that would have been too much. I mean, I would have liked to see a change primary fire, but these are still some pretty cool changes, and as I said, there's not much you can do with Zen. But what they did change significantly is his ult, and this is the one thing that you can change a lot, I guess. So they've basically changed it from being this defensive transcendence to basically being a placeable Sombra EMP. So what I mean by that is that you place down this area on the ground, like this big circle, and in that circle the enemy basically gets EMP'd in the fact that they can't use their abilities, like, you know, they get locked out from abilities like an Overwatch 1 EMP, I guess, whenever they're in that area. So the enemy can obviously just walk out of the area, but it is pretty big. And I do like this change overall. It's a very cool change that just reverses his entire ult's purpose, I guess, from being this defensive tool to being this offensive tool. I do also find it kind of interesting how, not exactly, but Sombra and Zen did kind of swap ults in a way. But overall, I do think it's pretty cool, and although the changes aren't anything special, they do feel pretty good to play with, in my opinion. And so he's definitely got to be in the B tier for me. So, what did you think about my list? Of course, remember that this is just my opinion, this is nothing objective, and this has nothing to do with how good the characters actually are in the mode, but I would love to hear your opinions and see what you guys have to say about Tracer complaining about why I put her in F tier. So anyways, I look forward to reading your comments, and I'll see you in the next one.